The horror genre is huge, spanning hundreds of diverse subgenres, from your standard monster movies and slashers to the downright bizarre. For over a century, horror movies have been a reflection of the fears of our society and culture, and it has become a genre so big and varied it would be almost impossible to cover in its entirety. So this is a very, very brief look at the major horror tropes from each decade, their cultural influences, and their effects on the cinema landscape. Hello and welcome to 100 Years of Cinema. This is a very condensed look at the history of horror. We begin seeing the iconography of horror in the very earliest films. In 1895, the same year as the very first projected movie, we see a decapitation in the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and later a dancing skeleton from the Lumiere brothers in 1897. But it was French filmmaker and magician Georges Méliès who was the real driving force behind this very early horror. The Manor of the Devil in 1896 is considered by many to be the very first real horror film. Méliès did something that couldn't be done in the Gothic literature that came before. He used trick photography, double exposure, and early special effects to bring horror and the macabre to life. Horror in the first decade of the 20th century tended to centre around ghosts, skeletons, and the devil, playing on supernatural and religious imagery. And you can see this in the films of Walter R. Booth, who in 1901 used trick photography to create terrifying floating heads in The Haunted Curiosity Shop, and Marley's Ghost in Scrooge. Alice Guy Blanche gave us Faust and Mephistopheles in 1903, and in 1907, Spanish filmmaker Sigourney de Chamon showed us the devil in his film The Red Spectre. But while these films were meant to amuse more than anything else, this style of trick photography would be carried over to the next decade, where a new generation of horror film would arise, films that were meant to terrify. Towards 1910, two new trends started to emerge. Horror starts to move from comedies to more serious movies, like D.W. Griffith's The Sealed Room from 1909, which tells the tale of two unfaithful lovers being bricked off in a room to suffocate. We also begin to see a rise in literary adaptations from American studios looking to cash in on established titles. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, there is an explosion in the horror scene with the rise of Expressionism. Stemming from resentment towards a World War I and post-war Weimar government, new developments in psychoanalysis, and an already established avant-garde art scene, Expressionism utilised set design and cinematography to externalise internal fears. It's through this movement we see the emergence of a new kind of horror film, the psychological horror. Starting with The Student of Prague in 1913 and Der Golem in 1915, and building to the expressionist masterpiece The Cabinet of Dr Caligari in 1920. The Cabinet of Dr Caligari revolutionised horror films. Its intense visuals raised the standard of horror cinema and proved the genre could be both critically and commercially successful. European filmmakers built on its success by producing Nosferatu, Faust, and Der Golem: How He Came Into the World. In 1920s America, we begin to see the start of what could be considered the first golden age of horror, starting with Universal Horror in 1923 and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This was followed by The Phantom of the Opera in 1925 and The Man Who Laughed, starring German expressionist actor Conrad Veidt in 1927. Universal horror would explode in the 1930s. Movies were now well into the talking era, and Universal exploited this to the fullest with two massive hits in 1931, Dracula and Frankenstein. These two films laid the foundation for modern horror movies and ushered in an age of big-budget monster movies. From then until the late 1940s, Gothic horror would dominate the cinema screen. By the 1940s, the tropes of the horror genre would be well and truly established, to the point where they were beginning to fall into parody. This changed when a newspaper journalist called Val Lewton was hired by RKO to produce a string of low-budget horror films. Lewton was given free range to create whatever film he wanted, but there were two catches. The film would be made on an extraordinarily tight budget, and the studio would supply the name. The first title supplied by RKO was The Cat People in 1942, and due to the tight budget, Lewton had to make do without the lavish sets and costumes from the Gothic horror cycle of the 30s, instead bringing terror through tone, mood, and suspense. The film introduced and gave its name to the cat scare. What followed was a series of low-budget horror films that focused more on mood, atmosphere and suspense rather than monsters, graveyards and castles. Classic examples are The Ghost Ship from 1943 and The Uninvited from 1944. By the 1950s, the world had seen firsthand the destructive power of atomic weapons, and a growing tension between the USA and the Soviet Union hinted at the extinction of the human species. These fears manifested themselves in the horror movies at the time, which focused on atomic monsters like giant ants or spiders, invaders from outer space, and experiments gone wrong. Around this time, cinema started to offer gimmicky thrills like stereoscopic 3D, but filmmaker William Castle elevated gimmickry to an art by placing buzzers in theatre seats set to vibrate whenever the monster from The Tingler showed up on screen, and taking out insurance to cover death by fright for his movie Macabre in 1958. While American filmmakers would be taking horror in a new, campy direction, filmmakers in England would be doing exactly the opposite. Hammer Pictures was founded in 1934 and focused mainly on producing quick, cheap films for British cinemas. But it wouldn't be until 2 decades later they would try their hand at horror with The Quatermass Experiment in 1955, which proved to be a huge success. They followed this with The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957, a violent and gruesome retelling of the Mary Shelley story. And although the film was a critical failure, it wowed audiences and earned back 70 times its production budget. This set Hammer down on a path that would see the revival of Gothic horror, but unlike the Universal films of the 1930s, which by then seemed rather innocent, Hammer horror would become known for violence, sex, and bright red blood. They were so successful that Hammer would produce sequels and spin-offs for their classic movie monsters throughout the 60s and well into the 70s. The success of Hammer horror had a knock-on effect of British studios and filmmakers moving towards horror films, and Hammer had given license to these filmmakers to produce violent and sexual imagery. Nowhere is this more evident than in 1960 with Peeping Tom by Michael Powell, which tells the story of a serial killer that carries a video camera to record the fates of his victims. The film, along with Psycho, helped establish the slasher genre, removing horror from its supernatural and religious themes and bringing it into reality, focusing on real-world terrors like killers, stalkers, and the abuse of power. In 1960, we would see 2 films that would irrevocably change horror cinema. The first was the product of a young filmmaker, George A. Romero, who would create a new kind of intense, unforgiving horror film. The independently produced Night of the Living Dead showed graphic violence in a way never before seen, and introduced a new creature to cinema's gallery of horrors, the flesh-eating zombies, which would reappear in endless variations. The second film was Rosemary's Baby, a supernatural psychological horror that took a claustrophobic and paranoid look at pregnancy. It explored extreme religious sects and Satanism. The film was a critical success and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay, bringing horror films a newfound respectability and ushering in a string of high-budget occult horror. 70s horror took an almost complete departure from its Gothic roots, as filmmakers started creating films that would further fragment the genre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween would popularise the slasher genre, while Jaws would pave the way for a slew of animal horror movies, including a whole cycle of shark movies. Filmmakers from Europe would popularise giallo, Italian horror which combined elements of mystery, slasher, and supernatural horror. In 1976, Brian De Palma created a new wave of teen horror with Carrie. But perhaps one of the biggest additions to the genre was David Cronenberg's debut film in 1975, Shivers. Playing on a newly emerging fear of sexual disease, Shivers helped launch the body horror craze that would become incredibly popular throughout the 70s and 80s. One trend from the 70s that would change filmmaking as a business was idealistic young filmmakers making schlocky horror movies for a few $100,000 and grossing millions at the box office. Studios were eager to emulate the success of these films, and Paramount Pictures found what it was looking for in 1980 with Friday the 13th, a clone of John Carpenter's Halloween with less story and more gore, provided masterfully by makeup legend Tom Savini. This led the way for the film franchise, studios would put out endless sequels regardless of quality or continuity, creating horror icons like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers. A new market that opened up in the 80s was the home video market. VHS was an overnight success, and it made possible the video nasty, a new type of horror movie that focused on gore and illicit thrills over all else. These films would never see a theatrical release, instead making their money on the television sets of teenagers and cult horror fans. By the 90s, the well-worn tropes of horror had fallen almost to the point of self-parody, and so a new wave of smart, self-aware horror movies arose that acted as commentaries on the established genres of the convention. In 1999, horror will once again change the entire cinema landscape, with the first film to effectively use the found footage technique. The Blair Witch Project was filmed by an amateur crew using off-the-shelf equipment and a budget of $60,000. It would become one of the most successful independent movies ever made, and ushered in a new age of cheap, low-budget found footage movies. With some notable exceptions, horror in the new millennium became increasingly formulaic, relying on endless found footage movies, remakes and reboots, along with the comeback of the splatter film, now rebranded as torture porn. However, since 2010, there has been a number of well-produced, smart horror movies, both from major studios and independent filmmakers, that show promise in revitalising the genre, showing that like a villain in a slasher movie, horror never really dies. Thanks for watching 100 Years of Cinema. My name's Charlie. If you take a look on this side of the screen, you'll see links to videos covering 3 different horror films from silent cinema, including one on the hands of Orlak, which I believe is somewhat of an overlooked gem from the German Expressionist movement. Now, the history included in this video is far from complete, so if you think that I have unjustly left out one of your favourite films, please let me know what it is in the comments below, as well as why you think it should have been included. Normally on this show we take a look at the history of at least one film each year from 1915 onwards to try and follow film on a journey from its origins in silent cinema to the massive blockbusters that we have today. And if you think that's something you'd like to support me in, I have just launched a Patreon and you'll find a link to it in the information box below. I need to buy better audio equipment. I'm trying to launch a dedicated site for the show, and I'd just generally like to improve the quality of these videos, so if you've been watching for a while and you'd like to support me, that's truly the best way to do it. But if you're not in a position to financially support the show and you'd still like to help, please comment, subscribe and share this video wherever you can, because all that stuff really does help. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned next week where we'll be taking a look at the first of 2 films from 1928.